The lieutenant held his rage in check, but only barely. He knew it was wrong. He knew he was incorrect, but his eyes told him a different story. Despite the protestations of his mind, his heart rebelled. They were being left to die. He had seen the bloody mess that was his captain, who had returned from his first meeting with the chapter master, the legendary Gabriel Seth. What a possessed madman to beat his new line officer to within an inch of his life. What kind of general would he be to these men? The Primaris that just so happened to have the blood of the angel, his very seed in them. For most, reunification with their designated chapter had been a moment of celebration, of camaraderie, of homecoming. But not so for those Primaris who had been sent to wear the colours of the Flesh Tearers. They had been viewed with suspicion, sneered at openly, or even ignored when they first arrived. Then their captain had been dragged out of his first meeting with the chapter master in a bloody mess. There was real concern amongst the Primaris, and the lieutenant was now seeing all of their fears come true. His captain had been leading from the front and was heavily engaged, so he left his number 2 in charge of the field oversight, the tactical overview. So it was the lieutenant could see the battle progress, could see its ebb and flow, and the Xenos tyrannid filth appeared in numbers far greater than had been projected. Far greater. He had informed his captain, but was met with a snapped answer to inform Central Command, nothing more. And thus the lieutenant had done so, but received no response. Nothing. It had been minutes, and in a battlesphere as complex as this one was turning out to be, even seconds could make all of the difference. His hand hovered over the button that would reissue the message. Everything told him to hammer down that button again and again until his communication was at least confirmed as received. The bugs were not as stupid or animalistic as standard citizenry were told. Not one bit. He knew that they could have disrupted communications. But if he did hammer away at the button, did send the message again and again, then he could be sending it into a room full of laughing firstborn. He could be seen as weak, desperate, unable to hold the line in the face of the enemy without panic. And that would translate to all of his Primaris brethren. Neither option was worthy of him sending it again. But what if they had not received the one message at all? Would he doom his entire company out of hesitation and pride alone? His hand continued to hover for another whole minute, but then the decision was finally taken out of his hand as a new chevron appeared on his screen. At first, he had thought it would be the precursor to a wave of them, but it was only one, no more. The drop pod slammed through the atmosphere and landed directly in front of the main thrust of the enemy, where the lieutenant had stated would be the most hazardous and vulnerable zone of the battle, the crux point. Other Primaris in front of the line looked to the skies, scanning for more pods, but saw nothing. Not until the drop pod opened. Its tentacle-like coverings jettisoning off from well-placed charges on its hull. The ramp slammed down hard, revealing its contents, and each Primaris on that gun line took in a sharp intake of breath in sheer shock and horror. A wave of clawing, chittering and screeching tyrannids hurled themselves forward, crashing towards the drop pod. So many. But inside the drop pod were only 5 Marines. 4 elite 1st Company veterans, the best the chapter had to provide, the sanguinary guard in their golden armor, and the one man none of them had expected to see. For in the midst of the 4 sanguinary guard, walking down the drop pod ramp, and then immediately beginning to pick up speed, as he seemed to charge directly into the very heart of this oncoming tsunami of flesh, it was him. It was the chapter master. It was Gabriel Seth himself. He had come personally. And something the lieutenant did not expect then happened. It happened spontaneously. It happened all across the line, and it happened with such speed that he could scarce believe it. For as the chapter master charged headlong into his foes, and began to cut a huge swathe through them, it began. A low rumbling at first, then louder and louder, until it filled every comm signal, every helmet. A bellow of anger, a bellow of rage. As one, the Primaris units across the sector stood and bellowed their rage as they leapt over their defences, abandoning their Codex-compliant positions. They charged. The lieutenant could not believe his eyes and ears, as over 30 Marines charged as one to save a man who they thought despised them, who they thought had led them into a trap, who they thought would never, ever accept them. But despite it all, there was one thing more powerful than any of that. Any concern, suspicion or doubt. The one and only thing that actually mattered at all. The Primaris saw. Their chapter master was in danger. Their lord was amongst his enemies and in danger of drowning amongst these filth. A fellow space marine, a human, a hero of the Imperium was about to die, unless they acted. And thus it was that the Primaris Marines broke every level of subconscious training they had received from their previous tutors, smashed every tenet and control, allowed the blood to sing in their ears and to guide their very actions. Like sons of Sanguinius, they charged! Gabriel Seth was like a force of nature, his two-handed giant chainsword Blood Reaver, carving out such a tally of destruction that it was hard to keep up with him. His every movement, his every action, twist or sweep, every single last motion was an attack. He was unstoppable. As the Primaris slammed into the Tyranids trying to encircle the Chapter Master and his guard, they turned the tide very quickly, and in mere moments, Chapter Master, Sanguinary Guard and Primaris Marine were all fighting side by side, shoulder to shoulder, tearing the flesh of the enemies of the Imperium, the enemies of humanity, as one. None who fought that day would forget it. And none of the warriors in the Primaris who saw their Chapter Master in action doubted any more. For he had come. He had come and he had fought for them, with them. He had bled with them, and they had bled for him. He had taught them without sermon, without lecture, but by action, what it was to be a true son of Sanguinius. He had shown them the way. And from that day forward, there would never be any doubt any more. For in that moment, when the blood was up and the foe in number, these men, these Primaris, they had proven that they were not shallow clones or cuckoos in the nest, for they had proven themselves true sons of the angel. They were flesh tearers now, and proud of it. And all due to one man, Gabriel Seth, Chapter Master of the Flesh Tearers. Welcome, gentle listener. I'm Baldermort, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and important figures of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future. And today we come to one of the heroes of the Imperium, and a very popular one amongst the fan base, for he is as blunt as he is uncompromising, as ferociously loyal to the Imperium, his chapter, and his bloodline as any other in the setting. Yet he is not shy of telling it how he sees it, a directness that is sometimes all too refreshing to read. But for the basics, let us lean on existing wisdom. To quote Gabriel Seth, Chapter Master of the Flesh Tearers. Gabriel Seth became Master of the Flesh Tearers as his chapter stood upon the brink of annihilation. Millennia of unrelenting savagery had left the chapter shunned and distrusted by many of the Imperium's fighting forces. Other Space Marine chapters viewed the Flesh Tearers as being but a single step from turning renegade, and the Inquisition had sought to have the chapter investigated. Worse, mutation in the Flesh Tearers' gene seed had exacerbated Sanguinius's curse, increasing the incident of the Black Rage. Even those flesh tearers fortunate enough to escape the Black Rage were gripped by a bloodthirsty recklessness that inevitably cost many lives whenever the chapter went to war. On the day of his ascension, Seth listened grim-faced as the chapter's sanguinary priest presented the evidence of the terrible truth. The rate at which their battle brothers succumbed to madness or death now far exceeded the Flesh Tearers' capacity to replace their losses. Within 2 centuries, the Flesh Tearers would be no more, abandoned by their allies and betrayed by their own flesh. Seth swore that if the Flesh Tearers' fate was to be extinction, then they would pass into history in proud remembrance, not through whispered rumours of brutality and madness. Under Seth's leadership, the Flesh Tearers' chapter planet of Cretacia has become little more than an automated armory and recruitment centre. At any given time, the bulk of the Flesh Tearers are off-planet, performing great patrol arcs through the segmentums Ultima and Tempestus, the chapter's librarians sifting the ether in search of astropathic calls for assistance. So it is that the Flesh Tearers will often be amongst the first wave of reinforcements to an embattled world, Seth himself leading boarding actions against enemy blockade vessels or counter-assaults on the invaders' drop zones before the foe have claimed as much as a foothold. Seth knows that he cannot realistically curtail his battle brother's bloodlust. Indeed, he himself is as prone to rage-soaked savagery as any of his brethren. Yet by striking first, and in isolation from other forces, the Flesh Tearers' worst excesses are concealed, as is the collateral damage amongst allies that once was the hallmark of the chapter's assaults. Now, worlds that once reviled the Flesh Tearers praise them as saviours. For all his efforts to challenge the commonly held perception of his chapter as berserk butchers, Gabriel Seth is every bit the bloody whirlwind when he plunges into battle. He wields an enormous 2-handed chainsword named Blood Reaver, and is more than capable of hacking even the most monstrous enemy limb from limb with it. As he fights, Seth lashes out at his opponent with vicious kicks, punches and headbutts, using every part of his anatomy as a weapon. The chapter master prefers to plunge headlong into massed foes before unleashing his full ferocity upon the bodies pressed in around him, and it has been remarked by Commander Dante that such luckless victims would have more chance of surviving a battle cannon shell landing in their midst. Indeed, the blood-drenched results are not dissimilar. End quote. Gabriel Seth and the Flesh Tearers have been one of the most important Successor chapters in the game, sometimes only barely behind the Crimson Fists and Black Templars in popularity, which I can assure you is nothing to sniff at. The Flesh Tearers were always a sort of blood angels on fast forward to many, as they have the same blood coursing through their veins, the same gene seed. And this has meant that many have looked at them and seen the ultimate fate of the entire lineage of Sanguinius. For they are space marines with a time limit, a shelf life, which was what made them so interesting. They were just an exaggerated blood angels, more aggressive, more prone to the red thirst and the black rage, so that they encapsulated the tragedy and the fury of the dying of this entire legion of Loyalists. They were its doom made manifest, the mirror none wished to look into closely. But recent changes have gone one way and then the next, and it has been through Gabriel Seth that we can see the change in lore and perspective of the Adeptus Astartes, the Firstborn, the sons of the Primarch, as they watch the Primaris introduced to the scene. For Gabriel was at first intensely negative to even the concept of the Primaris. Gabriel has also not held his tongue when it would have been politique, and gone as far as clearly stating that he did not trust the Primarch reboot Guilliman, that he did not trust these new reinforcements that arrived a little too much in the nick of time. He even confronted Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels themselves, so tantamount to the spiritual liege of all of the sons of Sanguinius, and now even the regent of one half of the Imperium, and stated that he thought it was treasonous to accept the Primaris, that they, Guilliman and Belisarius Cawl, had attempted to change the very will and intent of the Emperor himself by tinkering with the very seed of the angel in forming these new abominations, as he called them. The flaws were intended by the Emperor, hence their existence, that they defined the Blood Angels, and to try to do away with them as Cawl had stated he had, was in direct challenge to the plan and overall design of their emperor, the master of mankind. Seth stated that he feared that the Avenging Sun was trying to replace all of the offspring of his brothers so that they would be Ultramarines, just painted red. And in doing so, this character actually was elevated further by the fandom, by becoming something of a spokesman for the reticence to take on the new, to accept the Primaris at all. More than this, when he was finally met with an enforced reinforcement and met the captain of the Primaris Flesh Tearers, he acted with outright scorn, as what some may say, as he attacked the captain and beat him within an inch of his life. But nevertheless, once done, Seth then accepted them into his chapter. What is important here is that Seth again becomes the mouthpiece of the fears concerning the Primaris Marines. He whispers to the beaten and bloodied captain that he fears that if the Primaris are not perfect and not immune to the rage, which has subsequently turned out to be true, that they may well be so powerful, so enraged, that they are actually the doom of the sons of Sanguinius and Tyre, and will lead them down the red pathway to falling to chaos, to unfettered rage, to ignominy. Yet he takes on the Primaris into his chapter anyway. It is presumed that perhaps, just perhaps, Seth does hold some slight hope yet in his bloody fist, for perhaps he allows them into the chapter not out of any concern for censure from Dante, the regent, but because, despite his blunt demonstrations of his concerns, he does deep down hope, beyond hope, that maybe, just maybe, these new recruits, these Primaris Marines, may be able to resist the call of chaos, if he and his firstborn brothers can but show them the way, and that they could save the chapter he loves. Perhaps the Primaris can bring the nobility of the Angel back to the Flesh Tearers, and give them the one thing that they have not had for millennia now. A future. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope you have enjoyed this brief introduction to Gabriel Seth. If so, then please do consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications button, the bell thing, as I would not want you to miss out. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.